Well, thank you for having me. I must, every time I've come to Vancouver and to Canada in general, I must say that I have to eat some humble pie before I step up here. Obviously, Vancouver and the other major Canadian cities in every ranking of quality of life of great urban places are at the top, and American cities are well behind. And so, A, thank you for providing the model, and B, I question your sanity in having me here. I also question your sanity for being out on a Friday night at 7 o'clock. I mean, a deeply demented crowd that, but maybe it's because it ends at 9 o'clock and you can go out partying afterwards. I'm going to bed. What we're seeing throughout North America, and it's obviously you've seen it before we saw it in the US, is a structural shift in how we build the built environment. It started someplace back in the mid-90s, and it's a very fundamental shift that is the dominant social shift of our time. And again, you've seen it up close and personal here. Maybe you take it for granted, I don't know. But obviously you've built a beautiful city, but there's so much more to do. We are just at the beginning of this. When I teach my class up at the University of Michigan, the first thing I do, and I know you must think I'm a very harsh teacher, I make the students watch the movie Back to the Future. In Back to the Future, if you remember it 20 years ago, it shows two ways that this little made-up town called Hill Valley was laid out. 1955, downtown Hill Valley, 1985, downtown Hill Valley. Now, the 1955 Hill Valley was really a reflection of how we built places in the 20s. Because in the 30s and 40s, we didn't build anything. 1955 Hill Valley was basically an early 20th century American, and I dare say Canadian town, where the downtown had the movie theaters, the restaurants, high-density housing within a couple blocks, and virtually everybody lived within walking distance of that little downtown. Fast forward to 1985, when Michael J. Fox, a Canadian, is in 1985 is in a downtown where the movie theaters are showing X-rated theaters. The only people on the street are the homeless, and the central square has become a surface parking lot. And all the activity had moved out to the regional mall. That demonstrates the two ways that we can build the built environment. And it demonstrates the last great structural shift that we all engaged in back in the 40s and 50s and 60s into the 70s. And we're now engaging in a different, but in essence, back to the future structural shift. Let me first put it into context as to what we're talking about, because this research is just pretty new. We didn't know this a few years ago. We're talking about the built environment, real estate, your home, this building, and the infrastructure that supports the real estate, the street outside, the subway system, the buses, the things that allow us to build real estate. The built environment represents 35% of the asset base of any developed economy. It's the largest asset class. If you took all of the publicly traded companies in this country and multiplied their value by 2, it'd be less than the built environment. It is by far the largest asset class in our economy. It is where we put our wealth. It's where most of you in this room have your largest asset, in your home. So this is a significant set of decisions we make. However, we only add about 2% per year to the built environment. So it takes far longer than turning the proverbial supertanker to make a dent. On the other hand, it means that when we make a decision to build something, it's going to be around for a long, long time. I want to walk you through some urban history. Maybe some of you, maybe most of you know this, but it gives you a little context as to how we've been building the built environment since we started building cities a mere 5,500 years ago. And there's two lessons I want to mention to you, which is that up until 60 years ago, the fundamental way that we built the built environment was more akin to the 1955 Hill Valley. It was what I refer to as walkable urbanism, meaning that virtually everything that we needed for our daily life was within walking distance, which is somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 meters, which translates into a downtown about the size of downtown Vancouver, somewhere between 100 and 500 acres. And that was the premise upon which we built civilization for 5,500 years. Second lesson is that transportation drives development. Of the 15 infrastructure categories, by far, first among equals is transportation. The transportation we, the people, decide to invest in dictates the form of the built environment. And we've seen this throughout time. So go back to Samaria, and it's when you take a look at this walled city, that it's a rabbit warren. It's a walkable city, and very few people had access to horses. Basically, if you couldn't walk there, you didn't get there, and the city was built as a high-density place as a result. Fast forward to Pompeii, and in that tragedy, of course, we got this tremendous asset frozen in time, where we could see these 12 to 18-foot wide streets and sidewalks with retail right up to the sidewalk. It was basically a walkable urban place. Fast forward again to Pepys's London, and this is before the fire, of course. And aside from the fact that they could add water transport, this was basically the same urban fabric as Pompeii and as Samaria. Fast forward again to the largest town in the 13 colonies, Philadelphia, in 1800, about 100,000 people. And Kenneth Jackson, one of the great urban historians, estimated that no more than 1 in 50 lived further than a mile from where they worked. It was a high-density, mixed-income, walkable urban place. And even when we introduced the rail, that we all of a sudden had this opportunity to hop skip out to these commuter towns that we created. So you would think, the beginning of sprawl, but no, once you got out to the commuter town, you still had to walk home. Both where you left and where you landed was a walkable urban place. In between was farmland. Then, of course, we all know what happened as we introduced the car. A tremendous innovation. Had obviously tremendous consequences, and as we began to introduce cars to our walkable urban towns, we found that we ran out of room. And very quickly squeezed out room, and we, of course, the most important thing we needed to do was to park the bloody thing. And what we did is that we destroyed the village to save it, so we began to tear down buildings to build surface parking lots. And it squeezed out the transit. So this is up to the Depression, up to the 1930s. Because in the 1920s, in Canada, in the US, was sort of the height of understanding how to build great walkable urban places that included the incorporation of cars into the land plan. We had some of the finest towns and some of the finest trained suburbs developed. But then in the 1930s, the Great Depression, building permits fell by 60%. Going into the 1940s, during the war, building virtually stopped. In 1943 in the US, 50% of the gross domestic product was devoted to the war effort. There was no car production. There was no building. So for 15 years, half a generation, we didn't build much of anything. And the entire real estate business, therefore, went out of business. There's a great New Yorker cartoon, 1943 New Yorker cartoon of these two industrialists in this big office saying, now, what did we used to do before the war? That so much was devoted to the war, we forgot how to build cities, and we sort of got collective amnesia. And starting in 1946, after all the pent-up demand of the 30s and the 40s, we went down a path that we had never seen before in the history of the world. And where did that image come from? The best place, I think, came from the 1939 New York World's Fair. It was the largest World's Fair in history. And at the most popular exhibit at the largest World's Fair of history, 15% of North Americans went to see Futurama, the future of the world in that distant, distant year of 1960. And what it laid out was this fundamentally different way of living our lives, fundamentally different way of investing that 35% of our wealth. And I think you know what it is because we built it. It was a suburban dream that was car-driven and trying to leave behind what was, for most people, for most of our parents and grandparents, dirty, nasty, noisy places to live. And after you went through Futurama, you came out to see Futurama come alive where you could walk and see. Now, this is where they introduced this, what we've come to understand as a wacky concept of separating the sidewalk from the street. Unfortunately, Minneapolis and a number of other cities went too far with it, Toronto for that matter. And, but this really captured the attention of our parents and grandparents. And it bubbled during the war. And after the war, it burst forward. And in essence, we pushed the pendulum. We had been building walkable urban places for 500 years, and given something new, given something different, we're North Americans. We want something new. This is the new world. And we pushed the pendulum all the way over to the other side. And all we built was this new product that has never been seen in the history of the world, what I refer to as drivable suburban. And we know what it looks like. This is Levittown, of course. This is the great epitome of it. And the freeways were introduced. These all come from Philadelphia, which is where I was raised. Keep in mind, nobody held a gun to our head. We wanted this. And I remember I grew up in what could only be considered a 1920s new urbanist community. Walked to school, walked to the drugstore, walked to the Five and Dime. I once calculated that in my 12 years of public school, I walked 2,200 miles. Both ways uphill, of course, is what I tell my kids. When my mother took me on this freeway to the King of Prussia Mall, the first mall outside of Philadelphia, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And so did most of us. And we dedicated this huge amount of resource to building this. And we kept on building it. We got really good at it. And we continued to take our commercial strips further and further to the fringe, and we made it a very safe place to park our car. There's a final lesson from urban history that I think is relevant to note since we're in a bank, and this is a school of business. The underlying way by which we build the built environment is driven by the underlying economy of the age. In the 18th and 19th century, North America was basically an agricultural economy. In 1800, 90% of Americans worked on farms. By 1900, it was still 40%. More people worked on farms in 1900 than worked in factories. So the best way to describe how we built the built environment was that 1865 phrase, 40 acres and a mule. being self-sufficient to grow your own crops and maybe have a little surplus. Well, fast forward to the industrial age in the 20th century. The base of the industrial economy, fully 1/3 of all direct and indirect jobs, were focused on the car industry. Building cars, the metal that went into cars, the tires, the rubber that went into the tires, the oil industry, the insurance industry, the road building industry, the finance industry. You add it all up. Basically, when you were driving your Chevrolet to see the USA, you were making yourself wealthier. And as a result, we lived that same industrial dream. There is a direct connection between how we made our living and how we built the built environment. And that famous phrase of what was good for the country was good for GM and vice versa, by the chairman of GM in 1953 in front of the Senate, it was true. Obviously, this isn't just a North American image. This is the January 1st, 2000 Economist cover showing the future of the 21st century. And this is the Great Wall of China being surmounted by a freeway, obviously something that has obviously come to pass much faster than we've ever thought possible. By the end of this decade, China will be the country producing more cars than any other country. And of course, a little note to earth here that we all know that China passed the US last year as far as CO2 emissions. And here's an image from Prague, beautiful Prague, separated from the Western world by 50 years and by the Berlin Wall. And this is at the end of the freeway from Germany. As the freeway ends, on the north side of the freeway is a 2 million square foot super regional mall. On the south side is a big box power center and surrounded by car dealerships. People want this when they haven't had it. What happened is that we got really good at building this new form, this drivable suburban form. And it got commoditized by the financial industry. Give you a little bit more history. Back in the 1980s, you may remember that we in real estate went on a binge. We borrowed billions and billions of dollars, and we forgot to pay a lot of it back. And in the US, it cost about $250 billion to fix the financial system based upon the overbuilding of real estate and the collapse of the savings and loans and the collapse of many banks. As a result, Wall Street got into the real estate game. Wall Street does what public markets have done for 500 years since they've been around, since the Dutch invented public markets. They commoditize things. They can only trade like for like. It's not an art auction house. And so Wall Street got into the act in the early 90s, and they commoditized what we built. Drivable suburban product, and they made it a formula. And that's why when you go down to the US, most places look pretty much the same as every other place. Here's one example, which is a grocery store anchored retail center. The formula for this is that it's going to be 12 to 15 acres in size. It's going to be on the going home side of a major arterial with at least 25,000 cars per day. It's going to have a 20% lot coverage. 80% will be asphalt. The building will be back from the street. It'll be anchored by a 50 to 60,000 square foot national credit grocery store at one end. At the other end will be a 20 to 25,000 square foot drugstore on the other end. In between will be all the stores that you know and love, such as I Can't Believe It's Yogurt and the Hallmark card shoppy. And in the last 15 minutes of design time, the architect will look up from his drafting board, or from his computer actually, and ask the developer, where is this? And if he says, oh, it's in Southern California, they'll put little Mediterranean tiles on it. And if it's back east, they'll make it look like Williamsburg. But it's the same product, and you trade it like pork bellies. And this is how we laid it out in our country. You've done this not as much. You've had land use controls. You follow a European model of land use controls. It's more from the province down. In our country, land use is from the bottom up, from the lowest common government body up. And it's basically a beggar thy neighbor approach to business. And if you know three things in the US, this doesn't apply as much to Canada, you'll find out in a second why. If you know where the predominantly white upper middle income housing concentration is, and it always concentrates, 70 to 90% concentrates all around the same country clubs. And if you know where the local minority housing population is, which tends to be, if the topography allows it, 180 degrees on the other side of the metropolitan area, then if you know where the freeways are, you pretty much will know where all job growth has gone, and you'll pretty much figure out where most of the infrastructure investment has been made. It's been made in what I refer to as the favored quarter, the favored 90-degree arc coming out of downtown. And back in the 70s and 80s, most of that growth went out to what we came to call edge cities. These are metro centers, Metrotown, Tyson's Corner in DC, King of Prussia outside of Philadelphia, West Los Angeles, Newport Beach in Southern California. And then, of course, in the 90s, we went on steroids, and we went to the next ring of suburbs further out. Long story short, for every 1% population growth in the post-war period, we added 8 to 12% land use. Geometric increase in land consumption. Now, we have something very much in common with you and with the Australians. A, we're all English by stock, and B, we gain control over more land more easily than any civilization in history. We took over this amazing amount of land, and it was a snap. You know why? Our germs beat Native American germs. 90% of Native Americans were taken out by our germs. The reason our germs were stronger, by the way, is because we slept with our pigs back in the Middle Ages, and we built up great immunities, and it was a cakewalk. And the 10% that were left put up a hell of a fight. But, I mean, the game was over. When East met West, before the understanding of the germ theory, which came 400 years later, it was a foregone conclusion. So all three countries had this incredible bounty of land, far more than we knew what to do with, and therefore we did what anybody does when you have more than anything that you know what to do with. You use it up, throw it out, and move on to the next. And that's the 1% equals 8 to 12% land consumption. So at least in our country, and I can't speak for Canada, that we put in place after the Second World War, in essence, a de facto domestic policy that promoted drivable suburban development, that promoted the car and all the industries and all the jobs that it created. Oops, I mean to go back here. There we go. What we did is that we made drivable suburban the only legal thing you could build. I used to live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a fabulous walkable urban town, 400 years old, built according to the law of the Indies. And it, in downtown, 1.4 million square feet of retail, 600 shops, almost all mom and pops, a lot of office, a lot of housing, hotels, fabulously walkable. If downtown Santa Fe burned down, what's on the books in Santa Fe to take its place would be strip retail. You couldn't build what's on the ground today based upon what's on the books. That's common throughout the country. We also massively subsidized drivable suburban. Anywhere from 10 to 20 times the cost, we subsidized drivable suburban. In essence, it's, how we did it is that it costs so much more. I mean, if you put in a sewer line, it costs pretty much the same in a greenfield condition as it does downtown. It costs a little bit more downtown because you're dealing with existing conditions. But even if it was twice as much, it's the same general ballpark. Out in the suburbs, you're using it in the US at, say, 4 to the acre. In fact, many times it's 1 to the acre, 1 housing unit per acre. Downtown, it's 40 units to the acre. When you divide the cost by 1 unit to the acre, obviously it's a whole lot more per unit than if you divide it by 40 units to the acre. The parallel is if your government, in its wisdom, said that when you go out to a restaurant, that it has to be one price for all you can eat. Every restaurant, one price, all you can eat. What that means is that the people that are going to that restaurant on a diet are subsidizing those that are pigging out. That's the way that the infrastructure system was in fact rigged, and that the low density was being subsidized by either the taxpayers or by the high density. And the research shows it's, again, 10 to 22 times. Number 3, as I mentioned earlier, is that the finance industry commoditized the business. So all those Wall Street sharp guys who would be officed in the most expensive office space in the country, walking past the most expensive retail in the country, home to their $1,500 per square foot condos, couldn't finance that stuff. They could only finance drivable suburban. And 4th is that we in real estate, for 50 years, we made a lot of money doing drivable suburban better, faster, and cheaper. Only over the last 10 years have we begun to understand the unintended consequences. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to focus on 3. One is, of course, what we're painfully aware of now is this is an oil-dependent, in fact, a cheap oil-dependent system. And I think most of you would now understand, I think it's really becoming common wisdom on Wall Street, that we're at peak oil. That the amount of oil that we are going to produce over the next 100 years is going to be declining based upon what we have produced up until now. The US hit peak oil in 1970. 40 countries have hit peak oil since then. And the very fact that we've seen a 5-fold increase in oil prices over the last 4 years is one indication of it. A group of economists were polled by the Financial Times about what oil prices would be 5 years from now. The low end was $177 a barrel. The high end was $504 a barrel. That translates into $9.50 a gallon to $27 a gallon. Now, who knows what it's going to be? But we've hit peak oil. The other thing that we've learned is that the drivable suburban product has an Achilles heel. As you build more of it, you decrease the quality of life of the people that live there. There's this promise that you move to the suburbs and you'll have great convenience to get around by car, any place, anytime you want. You'll have open space, and it'll be clean, open air. Well, that next strip mall ends up clogging the streets more, creating more pollution, and wiping out the open space. It feeds upon itself, and it's what I refer to as more is less. The result has been something that we're going to deal with for decades to come, is the NIMBY opposition to growth. But it's rational. The NIMBY opposition to growth of drivable suburban growth is absolutely rational, because as you add more, the quality of life goes down. It's a rational reaction. The third thing that I wanted to point out is, of course, climate change. Obviously, the biggest issue of our era. And probably most of you know this by now, but a mere 73% of CO2 emissions comes from the built environment. Roughly 40% from our buildings, roughly 30% from our transportation system. 73% comes from the built environment. And Larry Frank's work which is not yet complete, but hopefully from Brookings by the end of the year, he'll be producing what I think will be the definitive connection between land use and CO2 emissions. Early numbers show that it's somewhere between that the difference between a walkable urban lifestyle household versus a drivable suburban household is somewhere around 2 to 3 to 1. That a drivable suburban house with 11, 12 car trips per day on average is 2 or 3 times as CO2 emitting as a walkable urban household where most of your goods and needs are met within walking distance. So you put those two pieces of information together, 73% of CO2 and a 2 to 3 to 1 ratio. It doesn't take a genius to see what the public policy response may have to be if we ever, and we're not serious, but if we ever get serious about climate change. Now, a funny thing happened. Just as we in real estate got really good at building drivable suburban, the market went and changed on us. Somewhere back in the mid-90s, that pendulum, which had been stuck building just one kind of product for 50 years, began to move back. And what the market wanted was this fundamentally different thing. What is walkable urbanism? This age-old, back to the future solution. The big difference with walkable urban is that whenever you add a new element to it, the quality of life, the financial performance, property taxes, just go up and they get better. Now, it's not, I'll come and deal with the unintended consequences. There's no such thing as a free lunch. But as you add more elements to a walkable urban place, it gets safer, it gets more vital, it gets more complex, prices go up, rents go up, property taxes go up. Now, I know what you're thinking, we'll get to that. It's a fundamentally different phenomenon. Now, the thing is, it's being driven by the market. This is not some planner that said, gee, we should do this. This is what the market wants. And it's really being driven by the Gen Xers and by the millennials even more so. This is the first major social trend that the baby boomers are in the caboose. And the best way to understand that is that you gray hairs out there, if you were listening to American TV back in the 50s and 60s, you were listening to Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet, and Dick Van Dyke, all set in the suburbs. Fast forward to the 90s, and our kids were listening to Friends, Seinfeld, Sex and the City, all set in the city, all set in walkable urban places. Hollywood does more consumer research than any industry on the planet. This is a reflection of what the market wanted. This is not Hollywood leading us by the nose. Obviously, the baby boomers are becoming empty nesters, and we know that empty nesters downsize. We know that empty nesters decide to try something different. We think they're moving more and more into walkable urban places. The big issue, though, is demographics and household characteristics. When I was growing up, 50% of all households had children in them. 50% did not. The target market for walkable urbanism is childless households. Not to say that it's one, it's not an either or, obviously. Many kids have been raised in the city for generations and for a millennia. But as far as a target market, childless couples are pretty much right there at the target. So when most of us gray hairs in this room were growing up, 50% childless, 50% households with children. Today, 2/3 of households do not have children living in them. Only 1/3 have children. Over the next 20 years in North America, of all the households being created, 88% will not have children. Only 12% will have children in the net new households added. That's pretty much baked. Demographics are not destiny, but this is pretty much reality. This is what's coming. The other thing, of course, is that if you're only offered one alternative way to live, most people get bored with it. And as I say, for 50, 60 years, that's all we offered. If you moved 20 years ago to Columbus, Ohio, and you wanted to move there to move into an upper middle income house, you had some options, you had some choices. You would move into your choice would be a single family house or a single family house. Take your choice. And if you wanted to go shopping for groceries, you'd go to a 1980s strip mall or a 1990s strip mall. You had no choice. Today, the young people are asking for those choices. And if you don't provide the choices, they're going someplace else. Obviously, the cost of energy is a major thing. What this has led to is a tremendous pent-up demand. A colleague of mine and Larry's at the University of Michigan did some very sophisticated trade-off consumer analysis in Boston and Atlanta, conceivably the two ends of the spectrum as far as metro areas in the US. Long story short, 30–40% of the market wanted walkable urban, 30–40% wanted drivable suburban, and 30% didn't know what they wanted. Go figure. Probably those 30% would probably take either. So like everything else in the US anyway, things get split right down the middle. 50% want or will put up with walkable urban, 50% want or will put up with drivable suburban. When you look at Atlanta, no more than 5–7% of the households are walkable urban. Huge pent-up demand. And go back to what I mentioned, only 2% per year. You do your math, it's going to take a generation to satisfy that pent-up demand. Another colleague of Larry's and mine, Chris Nelson out of Virginia Tech, did some projections about how this is going to play out on the ground. In 2003, there were 57 million large lot single-family homes in the US. His projections call for a loss of 22 million of those, based upon the demographics that I've just shared with you, based upon consumer preference. 22 million. Now, those homes are not going to be bulldozed. It's going to just depress their value. And they're going to be priced at far less than replacement cost. So what are we going to build? There were 49 million small lot and attached houses in the US in 2003. His projections call for a gain of 56 million. The whole game is in high-density housing. And I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, I heard this from somebody today, that 85% of your building permits last year were in multifamily housing in the region. That's what the market wants. That's what the market's going to get. So where are these places going? Let me run through these quickly. That there are 5 places that we know so far where this walkable urban place goes. And I want to walk through them all 5. The traditional downtowns, downtown adjacent places, a very interesting phenomenon, suburban town centers, suburban redevelopment, and suburban greenfield. I also only want to talk about regionally significant places. Most of you probably live in local serving neighborhoods. These are bedroom communities. Downtown is a regionally significant place. So I just want to focus these images on regionally significant places. I use Washington as a model. Believe it or not, Washington, D.C. metro area has become the model of how the country is growing. Most Republicans in my country despise this, but it's a fact. And it's primarily because of the metro system. One of the best heavy rail subways on the planet. And 20 years ago, there were 2 regionally significant walkable urban places on the ground in DC. Today, there are 20. And there are 10 more emerging, representing tens of billions of dollars of development. Here was one in downtown. Here's the US Capitol. Here's the White House. Downtown is this triangle. This is what it looked like 10 years ago. It was a place that you wouldn't be caught dead in. Then again, you might have been caught dead in. It's a miserable place. This is what it looks like today. It's virtually built out. It's been completely restored. It is the urban entertainment center of the region, and it's got the highest office rents in all but 3 cities in the US. And its office rents are 60% above the suburbs, and its vacancy is 1/2 the suburbs. An amazing thing happened is that all of our downtowns in the US have been losing market share as far as office space that's been rented over the last 50, 60 years. So back in the 50s, 90% of all office space was downtown. True here as well. And then for 50 years, that office space declined as far as market share. By December 1st, 2005, just 3 years ago, only 33% of all the region's office space was downtown. I'm talking private sector here, not the government. And then a remarkable thing happened, possibly for the first time in North American history. Downtown DC started gaining market share at these incredibly high prices. 40% of all the office space absorbed in 2005 went downtown, 46% in 2006, a comparable number in 2007. The big problem now for downtown DC, it's running out of land. It's got 15-year supply left. But it's not just DC. Obviously, downtown Baltimore, one of my favorite is Little Chattanooga, 350,000 people that redeveloped their downtown in a fantastic way. It's their living room. Portland, Oregon, of course. We get sick and tired of hearing about Portland in the US, I know. Chicago, of course, the Loop 15 years ago was desolate. Today, it's just this vital place filled with students, great theater, and Millennial Park. If you want to see a phenomenal park, go see Millennial Park. Mayor Daley has done an incredible job. This is a Millennial Park here. This is a great outdoor sculpture. San Francisco, of course. I mean, we always think of San Francisco as being great, but south of Market was a dive. Much of Market Street was a dive. The entire Embarcadero, of course, was a freeway. We had, in San Francisco, there was a 60-second urban renewal act and got a phenomenal boulevard to take its place. Oh, by the way, I do have to show you this streetcar. I grew up with that streetcar. Philadelphia threw it away. San Francisco bought it. It's now a tourist attraction. Philadelphia is finally learning.
The name of the bus, where did that come from?
Castro. Castro refers to the Castro district. Yeah. We would have given it to Cuba, but we weren't talking to them. But even downtown Detroit, by the way, I did a strategy for downtown Detroit. I realize I've now lost all credibility, but downtown Detroit is showing tremendous signs of life. Monday of this week, they announced a light rail line between downtown Detroit and the train station up 3.5 miles in the Motor City. Obviously, your downtown is remarkable. It is a sight to behold, ranked #1 by most of the surveys I've seen over the years. So I'm not going to tell you anything about what to do because you're doing everything that we all want to do. Downtown adjacent places are a really interesting thing. That these are places that take place around the downtown, and they all have lower density and an incredibly different character. So in DC, we have all these places all around the downtown. This is where I live in DuPont Circle, and then the West End. Let me show you. DuPont Circle 20 years ago was a very dangerous place, and led by primarily the gay community, it became this elegant place once again. The West End was a light industrial district. This is where the milk trucks park. This is where the police park their cars. This is the third to last building to be built in the West End, and then it's done. Obviously, your West End is a downtown adjacent place that's regionally significant. Your Granville Island is a downtown adjacent place that is regionally significant. And all around your downtown, you're developing the East End. You're developing regionally significant, walkable urban places around your downtown. But it's not just the downtown, and this is really, the bottom line of this whole evening. It's in the suburbs. That suburban town centers are really where the market wants to go. This is Bethesda, Maryland, a 19th century town with a great grid, great bones. And these Twin Towers, 10 years ago, it was a Bob's Big Boy drive-in. And a fabulous street life. This was a strip retail center. It's just come to life tremendously over the last 10 years. Here's the best model in the country right now in the US, in Lakewood, Colorado, southwest of downtown Denver, that this was Via Italia, the first mall built in Denver, had no more relationship to Italy than I do, and maybe these little arches somehow indicated that this was somehow Italian. What do you think, Elise? Does this look Italian to you? This mall failed by 2000. One store, this store, was the only store open. All the rest had shuttered it up. And this is what it looked like about 2 years ago. They bulldozed it all, put in a grid of streets. This is a Century Theater movie that they buried behind retail and offices. Lots of townhouses, condos, office and retail, or office and residential above retail. This is the only store left. In this parking lot is now a Whole Foods. And this is the street life of what's now called Belmar. And the price premiums here, to buy in here, you're paying 60% more than the rest of Lakewood because people want to be here so badly. This is Boston, outside of Arlington, or outside of DC. This is where most of the new and used car dealers were until they moved out to the freeway. This would have been a slum, but for Metro and for an overlay zoning district that encouraged high-density mixed use. And here's the granddaddy of all what's known in our country as lifestyle centers, a goofy term, that are greenfield, just add water and poof, you have instant urbanity. I worked on this back in the 20s, yes. 20 years ago. And today, it's really a small piece of Rockefeller Center. High density, towers, right up to the sidewalk, retail at grade. This will get a Metro stop in about 5 years. Obviously, your suburban centers are also redeveloping into walkable urban places, but they obviously need a lot of help. Did a survey a few months ago looking at the walkable urban places in the US, in the top 30 metros. Found some interesting things. Of the 157 that I found, they were split 50-50 between the center city and the suburbs. Something you might want to think about here. And 2/3 of these walkable urban places had rail transit. But it became obvious that there's a market for hundreds more of these things. The big challenges that we face to build this kind of thing, and I'll be interested to hear from the developers who are going to be on the panel next, is one thing is that we have to stop these subsidies to suburban sprawl. Mainly that takes the form of impact fees. It would be nice to make walkable urban legal. It's been tiring to do things illegal for the last 10, 15 years. I think that the investment community will catch up. A lot of education needs to be done. Obviously, we need to invest in walkable urban infrastructure. And a very important thing, these places need to be managed. This is not something that just spontaneously happens. It needs management. Business improvement districts are crucial, and they need to take a much more aggressive role than they're even taking now. So what are the unintended consequences of this new trend that we're dealing with? The obvious one is affordable housing. We've got a generation where the supply-demand equation is out of whack. My surveys show that walkable urban development gets a 40 to 200% premium on a price per square foot basis throughout the U.S. 40 to 200% more than single-family housing, more than strip retail. That's pent-up demand speaking through the marketplace. The other thing is we have to figure out what to do with all those obsolete single-family houses and all those strip retail. That's an article I wrote in the Atlantic last month that dealt with that. And another thing that comes up all the time is, gee, we build these great walkable urban places filled with mom and pops, and then Starbucks comes in, and all the big national chains come in. Another question that we have to deal with these large walkable urban places as they evolve. But I don't feel too badly. We figured out how to turn around our downtowns. If we didn't let our kids do something, they'd be really, really mad at us. So recommendations, obviously, you're doing this great new phase of the transit plan. You've got to pass it. You've got to implement it. You need more and more transit-oriented development overlay zones at those stations. You can deal with all of your population growth over the next 20 years at your existing stations, much less the new ones that you'll be building. You need to allow those stations within walking distance. Again, it's only 100 to 500 acres to densify. And that leads you all to figure out how to deal with the NIMBY opposition. By the way, there's something important to point out is, and I learned this first in Beverly Hills of all places, that you can mix great drivable suburban single-family housing with great walkable urbanism, back to back, right next to one another. My partner, who I bought a company from, he lived in Beverly Hills. He lived at a very famous intersection that I'm sure you've heard of, the intersection of Gregory and Peck, where Gregory Peck took his name from. Gregory and Peck, Bob Lesser's house, was a lovely single-family house, Mediterranean in style, worth $1 gajillion. 2 blocks away was Wilshire and Rodeo, the best fashion shopping in the country. 2 blocks the other direction was Beverly Boulevard, where there was a small grocery store and a small hardware store. Where he lived, only he and his guests could park in the street. There were traffic calming mechanisms all throughout. You would never see cut-through traffic. And it was just an elegant, quiet place. But 2 blocks in 2 directions, he had fabulous walkable urban development. You can get the best of both worlds. It needs to be managed. You need to create more, and I think nonprofit management organizations to manage these places. The government's not good at doing it. The best case studies are nonprofit business improvement districts or other kinds of nonprofits to manage these walkable urban places. The most important thing for you, though, is that using the Washington numbers, that there are 6 of these regionally significant walkable urban places for every 1 million people. That's what the 30 places in Washington lead you to conclude. 6 per 1 million. You should have somewhere between 13 to 15 regionally significant walkable urban places. By my count, you probably have 5 to 7 right now. Where are the rest? Where are they going to be? You should be deciding that. So here is the book, which my publisher would love you to buy. It's a nonprofit publisher, so they would love to be supported. And I believe it's outside. And if you're interested in the article in the Atlantic, you can get it online. I really thank you for the model that you provided. The Footloose and Fancy-Free work that I described, the survey I did a few months ago, is going to have a 2.0 version of it coming out, and it's going to be a North American version of it, because we need you all as a model badly. And we need to incorporate what you've done to set the bar higher for the U.S. So you've got a lot to do in the suburbs, but you have really set a very high bar, and I thank you so very much.
We're fortunate tonight to have a very, very strong panel, And this is easy as a moderator because I'm simply going to ask you, I think we spoke a little bit beforehand, but to have, I guess, we'll have Jim Cox speak first, and then Blake Hudima. I'll introduce him first. Jim is very well seasoned, as a real estate developer, 35 years, in fact, of real estate development in the field, including stints as president of BC Rail and real estate, so a lot of understanding of institutional issues and dealing with intersectoral complexities and perhaps some on logistics. And Director of Planning and Development for Marathon Realty, which is the real estate arm of BC, and as principal of Moody Consultants. He joined Vancity in 2007, just last year, to lead their real estate development subsidiary, Vancity Enterprises, which, as we all know here, is quite a massive opportunity for us. So I look forward to hearing about your vision of what you're going to do through Vancity. And Blake is VP, Vice President of Pacific Region for the Pacific Region of Genstar Development Company, which is also rather grand in scale, has a lot of opportunity to make impacts through that. And Blake is a registered planner and currently president of the Canadian Institute of Planners and past president of the Planning Institute of British Columbia and the past president of the Downtown Vancouver Association, and formerly sat on the boards of the Vancouver Parking Corporation, the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association, and the BC Shopping Center Association. So I'm sure that our panel will have a lot to say about Chris's talk, and I look forward to hearing your remarks, and I would ask that perhaps keep your remarks to somewhere around maybe 5 to 8 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for questions after that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks all. That was fabulous, Chris. But I'm going to be a little bit critical of a couple things. Partly because most of those developments you criticize so strongly, I was involved. Like, I did all that stuff, right? And this is not a shot. It'll sound like that. It's advice, right? Like it felt like you were blaming us for the last 50 years of development, and I don't really think that's fair, right? We did what we thought was the right thing at the right time, and we all bought cars. That was just what happened and what evolved, and really we're learning from that. I don't even know if we're learning from that. We're doing things differently now. And we're starting to build smarter communities, and I think that's good. But like, I'm interested in Vancouver, and maybe I'll just back up. Like, I work for Vancity Enterprises now, which is it's a little real estate development company that tries to build socially conscious real estate. And I don't know if that's after a career of buggering things up. I'm going to try and make things better, but I think the real estate industry, the financial community, like, they built this wonderful city and we made lots of mistakes, but I don't think we should be criticized too strongly. But what I am a little critical of, and I know I was involved in doing lots of things downtown. Like, I think Vancouver has an absolutely fabulous downtown in what is a pretty crappy region. I don't think we've done much else. If Blake and I were trying to think, okay, where were those 5 or 6, regionally significant places? I don't think we've done much of that, and I think we really have to. And the thing that I wonder about Vancouver, and Gordon wrote an article in your discussion of Paris. Paris is the same size as Vancouver with 3 or 4 times the population, or 2 or 3 times the population. And I know Brent Todderan has talked about, like, Larry Beasley, talks about the downtown, and Brent says it's fabulous, and it is. It's a great place. And then if you just pull the camera back a little bit, you look at this sea of suburbs, right? Once you're past Kitts, you're into this suburban area, and I wonder how the city's going to deal with that. And this gets to, I think your point, I would simplify it a couple ways. We're going to have to stop driving pretty soon because we won't be able to afford it. many of us can't afford it now. It's very expensive, and many of us don't do it very much anymore because it's very negative on the environment. So we're learning. I learned from my daughter when she told me I was a Neanderthal about my big car. I mean, we learn from the younger people, and that's great. But I wonder how those communities are going to change, and I think it's a huge challenge. And the other side of it is density, and it's yours. More is more. I guess what I have to say, I'm having trouble paraphrasing that, but I think in Vancouver, because more is less, we're having a very difficult job doing more is more. And the notion of eco-density, and we can object to the phrase or whatever, I just don't think I think it's going to have a real tough time happening. I live on Bowen Island, right? Stake through the heart of new urbanism. But we're trying to create a sustainable urban community on Bowen Island, which actually it could be, because we all have to gather in one point. It would be perfect for transit, right? We could all take transit, most of us do now, from the ferry into the city and the city back. But that community is dead set against, when you add a second story that somebody might live in, they're not doing that. So I really think, I agree with everything you said, other than sort of the fact that a bunch of us are to blame. But I think we have a huge task ahead of us creating these regionally significant communities. I don't think we've done a very good job of it in Vancouver. We've done a great job downtown. You might have examples, people in the audience could tell me where some of those great regionally significant. I think we have some great neighborhoods throughout the city and throughout the suburbs, but not regionally significant places. And the last point I'll make, and turn it over to Blake, because he's actually trying to create some of these suburban places. Transit, we just have the crappiest transit system of any city I've been in. And I've been to Washington several times, and I love it. I've been to a lot of big cities, and transit to me is the solution, and we got to spend a ton of dough on transit, and we got to do density, and that's the way we'll create a livable place, and we'll create affordable housing, because density is going to be the only solution, in my view, to affordable housing. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Jim. And again, it was a real pleasure to listen to the perspective of one that brings a market perspective into city building, into community building, because I think it's something certainly in this country, and going through the spectrum from sort of the public or community planning side of things through to the market-based and development community. We don't often bring that perspective in such a, I guess, a poignant or an important way that I think you've done in this one. You can always agree with things. You can always disagree with certain things. And I think for me, in going through, listening to you here, listening to you talk through your book, I think I'm a little less optimistic about the pent-up demand in all of this. I like the and obviously advocate that the market, and we were free to build suburban areas. We were free to build regional shopping centers. We did those of our own free and economic will. And I think if there was really a huge pent-up demand, we would see that happening in a far greater pace than we might be at this time. But I did pick up on a couple of things, and I think what you're doing is speaking to, obviously, the converted, speaking to many of us who believe this is the way it absolutely should be. And I think one of the major challenges, obviously, much in the way Mr. Gore has done with the climate changes, how do we really take that and mainstream that? How do we take this into the folks that really will make the difference? And unfortunately, we're going to enter into an environment that is schizophrenic, it's complex, it's filled with change, and it's filled with fear. And I think we're seeing that on both sides of it. I think the market looks for simplicity, it looks for comfort, it looks for areas where we can take risk out of what we're doing. And if we can find those comfort zones, we can build exactly what the general population wants. We've gone through a baby boomer generation where 50 or 60% of the population was relatively homogeneous. We're going into a current environment and a future environment that's sort of akin to the Star Wars bar scene in terms of diversity. We are trying to figure out on both the public sector side and the private sector side who are we serving and what quantity should we be serving with them. And I sense in, I think you rightly point out that the financial community ebbs and flows in terms of their exuberance for what we're doing and, of course, their current hesitancy for what we're doing. And I think that's going to get even more complex as the supply diversity expands and the demand segments expand into a whole variety of different family types, into different tenure types, into different household types. So I think we're in for challenging times, and I think the imperative is probably to get this out into the mainstream community. Those folks that chose to go into a suburban environment, those folks that went out. You see some very good examples. You see some very heartening examples. At the same time, when we look at the shopping center development, in 1970s, in the early 1980s, we saw the regional shopping center. We complained about that. We criticized that, when indeed that was probably a higher density model than we now see with large format, with large big box development, and lack of general architecture in most of the commercial. So I think in many ways we've taken a huge step backwards in terms of one form of land use or built form. And I'm fearful that we might head that way within, and as we get more complex, we're hitting probably average of $1,000, $1,100 a square foot to afford a place in downtown Vancouver. We're hitting suburban environments where we're getting hit with charges, and both codified and uncodified charges and levies and other expenses. And as you point out, real estate is commoditized to a business that's probably 15 to 20%. So with those diverging types of influences, I think we're in for a real challenging time. And as fast as we can get that out into the mainstream is going to be our salvation. So thank you again.
Maybe
I think we're... Yeah.
Well, I'll stay for about 10 minutes.
Okay, we're going to open it up now for questions from the audience. And so anybody have a question for either of our panelists and for Chris? So Chris, you want to, we're here. Okay, so what we'll do is please come up to the microphone. There's two. So we can, I think we're recording this. So remember, you're being recorded.
My name is Jan Timmer, I'm an architect. I'm just curious, Chris, about the private sector-led walkable urban areas. What is the incentive for those non-profit managing organizations to run these centers around the transit stations? I'm just curious about, as opposed to a government-run organization or just purely a private enterprise. And I'm reminded in Tokyo, which is about 30 million people, transit forms the nodes, and then around these transit nodes there are walkable urban communities, which is a cultural phenomenon, and it seems to work fairly well even in a very, very dense urban area like that. I'm not quite sure how that's managed, but I'm just curious about the non-profit led ones.
I'm just sort of reporting from the front as far as what seems the best cases that I've been able to find, and they tend to be nonprofits. They're funded by property owners. So these are business improvement districts primarily would be the form that they would take. But what we're seeing is more and more business improvement districts are going to the next level. They all started with a clean and safe approach, and then they move into a horizontal development approach. They get into putting in more and more infrastructure. They're getting into the management and rebuilding of parks, and they're beginning to really brand a place and understand what the experience is that the visitor, the resident, the worker wants out of that place. And so it's a much more aggressive, and Blake mentioned it, that the future is far more complex than the past. Drivable suburban development, it's a keep it simple, stupid approach. And by the way, I do have to mention, Jim, you and I share the same history. For 20 years, I ran a company called Robert Charles Lessering Company. I owned it, which is the largest real estate consulting firm in the country, in the US, working on 600 projects per year, primarily for private sector real estate developers building drivable suburban. We worked, and the firm still works, I sold it about 8 years ago, works on more master plan communities, and they're all drivable suburban. So I mean, you and I, if I'm blaming you, I'm blaming me. And I also really do want to re-emphasize, nobody held a gun to our head. The market wanted what we built in the 70s and in the 80s. I'm just saying that the market wants something different now. And what they want is far more complex. My analogy is that what we in real estate for the last 50 years learned is that we learned how to drive a car really well. We could take great corners, 2 dimensions we could handle very well. We're now being asked to fly a jet, and that jet is a lot faster. It's dealing in 3 dimensions, and the ups are a lot higher, and we can crash and burn so much easier. It is a so much more complicated thing that we're being asked to do today. And we're just relearning how to build walkable urban. We lost that ability for 50, 60 years. Yes, in the back.
My name is Jo from Vancouver. I have a question to the panel as to what are your comments on how parking policy could influence on the marketability of workable communities, and how does it affect the marketability of new social sustainable developments in the region?
That's a great question. Jim, Blake, do you want to?
Well, the comment I would make on parking is bloody expensive, and we should do a lot less of it, right? And if we're building these walkable urban communities, you don't need parking. Most of our projects now, we sign everybody up to the car co-op. We buy a co-op car, and you find they need half as many cars. The trick is getting the community to let you build half as many parking spaces, you know, and at $35,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 a space, you wonder why you can't make housing affordable when you got $50,000 sitting down, you know, in the ground being wasted. So I'm a big supporter of less parking.
Blake?
Yeah, I think it's probably just a look at the efficiencies of what we're doing. We built land use, we built things like parking structures at a highly efficient rate, and probably the salvation is figuring out what the performance base of those parking stalls are, both from a demand perspective and a supply side, so that we're actually camping land uses together, integrating land uses that by default or by default will make better use of that parking in proximity.
Yeah, parking drives development historically from a drivable suburban point of view. That the parking solution told you what you could build. In the downtown here, you don't obviously have as much of an issue. Quite honestly, having a parking problem is a sign of civilization. It goes back to the old expression, the old yoga bear, what a Yogi Bear would say, that nobody wants to go there because it's too crowded. So it's a sign of civilization when you have a parking problem. Downtown Santa Fe always had a parking problem, and 2 million, 3 million people kept on showing up each year. In the suburbs, it's a different story because it's sort of a process. In the early years, most people will get there by car. But then as you build more walkable urbanism and you shift more and more people to walking, the ratios of how much parking space per unit, how much parking space per 1,000 square feet drops. So over time, you know, early on, Metrotown's going to need a lot of parking. 10 years from now, it's going to use half that parking as far as the ratio of parking to heated space. So it's a process over time. It's complex. Yes? In the back.
Hi. My name is Jasmine Bleak. I'm working as a consultant here. My question relates to the integration of office components into these walkable suburban and walkable urban developments, both continentally for you, Mr. Leinberger, and also from a more regional perspective here. I was wondering what the challenges and prospects are for integrating office development into these projects.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Office integrates quite well. into walkable urban places, what we did in the drivable suburban world is that we, of course, separated land uses. We didn't want, and so it was very simple back then. It was just, you know, you drew these two-dimensional master plans, and with big pens, you would say, this is where the office goes, this is where the retail goes, this is where the housing goes, and you separated it and connected it with major arterials, of course, all car-driven. There is no reason that you can't fully integrate into a residential area or vice versa, integrate residential into an office area, because the means of production today is clean. You know, in the industrial era, which is a blink in time, it's now past, you obviously wanted to separate land uses. In the post-industrial knowledge-based economy, offices integrate very nicely. I live in the DuPont Circle area of DC. My street is townhouses, all within walking distance of everything we need. I back up to embassies, office buildings. And it's great because the office buildings during the day, during the day, they're occupied. I'm not there generally during the week, during the day. At night, they're empty. And on weekends, they're empty. It's a perfect shared use of our little common space, our little backyards that we have. So they integrate quite nicely. Yes. Yes?
My name's Liz Watts, and this is a question for Jim Cox. Well, starting with you, I'd like you to describe your ideal vision of a transit system that's not a crappy transit system, and I'd like you to sort of maybe it's a service question or maybe it's a form question. I'd like you to maybe sort of give us some ideas about what you'd like to see, and then I'd be interested in Blake and Chris's comments with respect to the Vancouver situation.
Well, what I'd like to see is 2 or 3 times as much transit. I think I'd like to see it out into, you know, all the suburban communities, because I think that's a way it makes it affordable. What I imagine, right, my view of the world, and I do this now, so maybe I'm just trying to protect myself. I'd like to see an ad for, and I'll offend most of you. You know, when I was a kid, I read Playboy magazine, and there was always an ad in there that said, "What sort of a man reads Playboy?" And he was always, you know, anyways, cool-looking guy driving a Porsche. I'd like to see that ad with a guy sitting on a bus or sitting on transit. I think transit will, maybe not in my lifetime, but in many of yours, will be, car driving will become like smoking. And transit is going to become the cool thing to do, and I'm doing it, right? So I've already started the trend. So that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see... Your daughter started the trend. Yeah, that's right, yeah. So that's what I would like to see in terms of transit. Well, I mean, I'd like it to be able to, I'd like to go beyond, you know, central Surrey. I'd like to see it to go into Coquitlam and Port Coquitlam and Mission and much more of it, so that it's a choice for everybody to take.
So you're
Blake?
happy with buses and stations the way they are, or do you think they could be better?
I mean, I actually take a bus almost every day to work, and it's not bad, right? It works pretty good for me. I have well, okay, I tell you what I'd like to see. I have an express bus. I get on in Horseshoe Bay, makes one stop, drops me downtown. You know, what could be better than that? I travel around downtown. I take transit all over. I'd like to see everybody having that opportunity. But you have to design the communities, and that's why I guess so that you can have an express bus, and it has worked. So the planners have to do it. And I guess the other thing, and a point I wanted to make, what really pisses me off about this place is we did a pretty good job of concentrating a bit of retail, some retail, because I think Metrotown is doing that, and some population downtown. We've done a really crappy job of concentrating jobs. So most people have to drive to work if you're working anywhere other than downtown, and I think that's part of the problem with transit.
Yeah, I think probably from a transportation perspective, we probably need a greater variety of systems at a whole variety of scales, where Obviously, we're getting better at putting the major spine infrastructure in terms of ALRT, in terms of heavy rail, West Coast Express, those sorts of things. But and we have a lot of structural impediments to getting those smaller systems, whether they be unions, whether they be cost, whether they be in the balance between should we invest huge sums, the billions of dollars, to put in place the 50-year solution, or should we look at the 10-year solution with minibuses, smaller buses? My hope is, and I think we're probably seeing this places like Langford on the island, the community, looking at and getting the customer used to, or getting the resident used to, more frequent service. And I think that's the key on the one end, is just introduce the opportunity, the choice on a much more frequent basis. Because I think any of us, and all of us that have traveled to centers, urban areas that have frequent service, no matter what the rapid transit or mass transit system is, we just love it. One of the things we're dealing with here, obviously, is large geography. Trying to retrofit in a system that was based on cars and pavement and bridges. How do we bring that to bear quicker? I think we err too much on the big trains as opposed to smaller systems, more responsive systems, more performance-based, community-based systems that feed into those.
Let me just mention, I mean, I'll come out of left field maybe, but I would urge you that there is no reason to build another road that, and in fact, expanding some roads might be inappropriate. I think 5 and 10 years from now, you're going to look at the investment you're making today in roads and say, what were we thinking? And I would urge you to consider undergrounding as much as possible your transit. And the reason for it is purely real estate. That you don't, we learned 100 years ago that you don't build transit for transportation's sake. You build transit to sell real estate. And that by putting it underground at the station, you'll have 360 degrees out 1,500 meters each direction of high-value real estate. You put a above ground or at grade transit in, you always have the wrong side of the tracks. So you only have 180 degrees times 1,500 feet. And so I would urge you, put it underground. Now, I recognize the cost implication. You put it at grade, it costs X. You put it above grade, it costs 2X. You put it underground, it's 4X. But if you will make it up, and you should tax to make it up, in the increased land appreciation at those stations. I would also tell you that you could afford to do it underground with your new system and just focus on those stations. Your growth for the next 50 years you can handle just in the existing and those new stations. If you put them underground and do it right, you'll handle all your growth. You don't need another square inch of land added to this metro area.
I've got to excuse myself
to
I've got to get
catch
the
your
bus,
mass
otherwise
transit.
I'm going to miss the ferry.
Good, Jim. Thank you.
A couple of questions out on you then. What do you do with a dead McMansion? What are you doing with a foreclosed mega house? And what do you do with an unnecessary underground parking garage? What would be the first steps that you could take to make them more, well, what do you do with them? Are they things that actually do have enough flexibility so you can begin to use them for other purposes?
No, they're very inflexible. The Driveable Suburban is a single-purpose built place. And this is going to be a real crime for certain, and it's going to be a hit for a lot of individuals' personal balance sheet. That the only thing we can learn from is when this cycle, or when the structural change last happened, back in the 50s and 60s, particularly in the US, but also here, where we threw away our cities as we pushed the pendulum towards drivable suburban. And a lot of people, and in our country it was white flight, driven by race. Race in our country is first and foremost in every decision, particularly as far as land use goes. And as that white flight took place, a lot of middle and upper middle income white families took a big hit to their balance sheet as they ran out to buy new construction on the fringe and sold their existing house at a much reduced price. Those houses were extremely well built because they were built before the 30s, for the most part, almost exclusively. They were broken up into apartments. And that's the likely outcome, is that these McMansions will be broken up into apartments. But they are not made anywhere near the quality of the homes built before the 30s. And they're just not going to hold up. So I think we have a significant reclamation that we have to engage in, i.e. tear down.
Yeah, on two fronts. One, on the built front, those that can withstand the retrofit, and I'm I think a little more optimistic, as we've seen in other parts of older neighborhoods, retrofitting into McMansions, into duplexes or fourplexes or beyond. And I think especially when we look in the future at the great number of different market segments, I think we're going to find bachelor suites, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, basement suites, granny flats, a great number of folks taking those up. So I'm much more optimistic. When it comes to things like I'd mentioned the large format retail, the big box in the suburbs, really what we've created is temporary land use, and the only saving grace there is that we can bulldoze those without really impacting the world. And I think we're now starting to look, and especially in places like Northwest Atlanta, we're looking at buying what was suburban ranchers on quarter-acre lots, half-acre lots. We can buy 4 or 5 of them and retrofit those into much more dense and at least within that small enclave, walkable or usable.
But that's a bulldoze.
That's absolutely a bulldoze situation. Yeah, there's probably no redeeming value in much of the structures that we built in the last 30, 35 years. It's disposable buildings.
Well, underground parking garages have some really interesting potential uses. I mean, the artists would love it. There's all sorts of, our kids, teenagers will come up with all sorts of strange games to play. I mean, if we had paintball in our age, can you imagine what they're going to come up with? Lots of urban entertainment concepts that could go there. Yeah,
underground, I mean, the classic example here, underground at Pacific Center, daylighting, trying to daylight real estate that's formerly been underground. In many cases, multi-story parking lots, unusable, but who knows? Gardens, hydroponic.
Hydroponics, server centers. I mean...
Now.
Yes, in the back.
I'm too young for that.
Stefan Nieweller, consultant. I have one question for each of you. The first one is about the Gateway program, and how do we resolve this tension between goods movement and, building all these roads, which is going to cause the sprawl? Because goods movement is an issue as well. How are we going to do that? Second question is these examples from Washington and elsewhere. What kind of policies were behind it, like tax increment financing maybe, or the bonusing, density bonusing, these types of things? And what actually made these things happen?
Good question. Do you want to start with the freight?
Yeah, I'll just take a swing at the Gateway at my own peril. Obviously, I think what we're facing in terms of the Gateway program is an evil that was thrust upon the region by a lack of investment on a more national front. We've got a lack of a port facility. We've got a lack of a national transportation system, especially in a rail-based system, that's forcing us to look at stopgap measures in a regional basis. But if the national agenda, the national transportation agenda was probably more advanced, I think we'd probably get away from having to necessarily expand the pavement base and pay much more attention to our existing rail base. Probably get rid of most of the impetus or demand for expanding those road-based or pavement-based systems.
What we're seeing in our country, and I'm not certain if it applies here, is that obviously the freight lines, the various rail systems are engaging in a huge boom in reinvesting in their rolling stock, reinvesting in their track, and laying more track for the first time in a century. So we're going to see a shift, obviously, back to rail, which is a far cheaper way of moving goods. But the other thing which, and this might just be wishful thinking on my part, but we're engaged in the new transportation bill. Every 6 years, the U.S. engages in how to spend the gas taxes, and next year is that year. And there's a lot of discussion that the truckers might get behind a greater investment in transit. The same reason that a lot of people voted for transit that were driving their cars. They want to get the other bastard out of their car so they can get to work faster. That you get people out of cars completely, get cars completely off the freeways to allow the trucks to have better access. Because obviously trucks serve a very important function in our society, and they're getting bogged down by all of our single occupancy cars that we drive around. What was the
second? Yeah, if you can just
what was the second question?
The policies behind.
Policies. Very important, and I probably didn't emphasize this enough, that the transit is crucial. Equally important is the public policy to allow for overlay zoning districts on top of those 100 to 500 acre places to make walkable urban development legal. And in fact, encourage the right thing. Make the right thing easy, in other words. As I say, right now in the US, generally speaking, walkable urban development is illegal. You have to change the zoning, get variances, all sorts of brain damage until you can turn a spade. I had a project that was zoned for a high-density development, but the neighbors or the township didn't want it. It took me 7 years to get the entitlements. Only once I got, it was the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer that asked the question, why don't we build walkable communities in William Penn's town, where he laid out this great city, and they focused on my project and shamed the township into letting us build this walkable project. 7 years of beating our head against the wall. So it'd be nice, so the public policy is at those stations, put the overlay zoning to allow high-density, complex, walkable urban development. In the back.
Okay, my name is Paul Pinsker. I'm a transportation engineer with the City of Vancouver. And first of all, Chris, I want to thank you for some of the information you've given us tonight. We're looking at Neighborhood Centers program at the City of Vancouver. We're involved in planning walkable community centers in neighborhoods across the city, such as Norquay Village, Mount Pleasant, et cetera.
And so these are all possibly local serving walkable urban places.
Right, and
so,
we're trying to make them much more pedestrian friendly. This is the whole idea, just exactly what you're talking about. And I think it's helpful that some of the statistics you're giving us, like 100 to 500 acres, which to me seems about 1,000 to 1,500 feet radius from around the heart of these
and that
centers.
100 to 500 is generally a regionally significant place. Local serving places tend to be smaller.
Right. So I mean, some of the things we're doing is we're looking at our parking requirements right now. We're going to be getting some new powers from Victoria, which are going to allow us not merely to be able to review developments on the basis of the building class or the use, but also on sustainable activities. And so when Bill 27 gets third reading, the city will have a new legal avenue to just how the way we look at reviewing developments in the city. And then we can do, and Jo Fung here, who spoke earlier, she's one of the architects of this as well. So, but the question I had for you, though, was actually not transportation, though. It's actually, if you've been in the city any length of time, you've probably seen that probably the number one issue is affordable housing. And I'm amazed that we haven't touched even lightly on that at all tonight. We had Cooper's Lookout, one of the Concord Pacific's current developments, advertising itself as the last waterfront housing on False Creek for under $1 million a unit. And I shudder to think what they're getting at Millennium's development. I shouldn't name developers' names anymore. But over at Southeast False Creek, in the Athletes' Village, et cetera.
which we're getting very high-end development now, and I think the market is dictating the price, and it's all because, like you said, that Vancouver is so desirable of a place to live that it just pushes the price up. What I'd like to see are any insights you might give us in how we can achieve more affordable housing.
There are two categories of hints. One is the short-term measures, policy measures. The other is longer-term measures that will take more time to unfold. Because I did mention affordable housing is the #1 unintended consequence of this. And the short-term measures I've seen that work is, of course, inclusionary zoning is a no-brainer. That, in essence, you 5, 10, 15, 20% of all housing units in a project over, say, 5 units must be affordable by some definition. What that does, though, is, of course, the new people coming in are paying to subsidize that affordable unit. If you put it over a large enough area, it's going to, in essence, lower the land prices. And at that moment that the law goes in, land prices will drop. And then they'll start going back up again. So it is something that will the subsidy will not be felt, and it'll just become business as usual. Montgomery County, Maryland, put in place an inclusionary zoning ordinance 25 years ago. They have 12,000 units on the ground right now, permanently affordable, over a wide swath, integrated within all the upper-end housing that's in Montgomery County. It's a very well-to-do county, and it works. That's one. Second is, of course, if you have tax credits, I don't think you do in Canada, but certainly in the US, we have low-income tax credits. We are pushing to have workforce tax credits, so that's the taxpayers subsidizing a certain amount. You should allow granny flats to be legal. It's insane, and this is the simplest thing you can do, and it helps the people who are buying those $1 million places to help pay the mortgage by having a separate entrance to an auxiliary unit. It is criminal not to allow your school teachers to live where the kids live. And there's 3 or 4 other things that are short-term. They help get you there a little bit. Just outright subsidize it. The other thing, though, which is more long-term, that's going to solve the problem eventually, is more supply. Ultimately, the issue here is the pent-up demand. In real estate, value puddles in the land. Yes, it costs more to build high-density projects on a cost per square foot basis, but it doesn't explain the 100 to 200% price premiums per square foot that you're getting, or per square meter that you're getting in downtown versus a comparable unit right outside of downtown that's a drivable product. The main reason for it is you don't have enough supply. It's the NIMBYs that are stopping densification around transit, not allowing enough supply to come on to lower the land prices in the marketplace. I never thought I'd say this, it's a supply side problem. We don't have enough. And then the second long-term thing that has to shift, I'll give you a historical perspective. 100 years ago in America, I can't speak for Canada, 35% of our household budget went into housing, 3% went into transportation. Today, it's 25% into housing, 19% into transportation. We in the real estate industry have let the market share of what we capture in the built environment get beaten. We've been beaten by Detroit and Tokyo. We need more and more of the household income to be going into housing, less to go into transportation. If you dropped one car out of your household, AAA in the US says in 2007, you drive 15,000 miles per year with a Camry, it costs you $7,800 per year to own and operate that car. Insurance, parking, service your debt, all the rest. You put it into a 6% mortgage, even with the fact that you don't have tax deductibility of your mortgage interest here, you're talking about $100,000 to $125,000 extra mortgage. That's 1/5, it's 1/4 of your average cost of your house here. Drop one car, put it into your house. You drop it, you take it from a depreciating asset and put it into a appreciating asset. Those two are what's going to change and make it more affordable.
Right. So that advice certainly is like for the individual and how they run their household. But some of the other advice, for example, that we build more housing. I mean, that would be great. I mean, but when City Council has 4 or 5 nights of public hearing for a 16-unit project on Dunbar Street, I mean, it saps City Council, it saps staff. And as well, there's only the development pipeline at City Hall is only so big, with all the review effort that goes
You've got to
into
make the
every
right
individual
thing
project.
easy.
Yeah,
In
so
downtown
those are some of the
Albuquerque,
challenges we have.
I was responsible, I had a catalytic development company to start the redevelopment of downtown Albuquerque down in New Mexico. The first thing we did, we threw out the zoning. And we put in place this overlay zoning district on 300 acres of downtown. It had 21 principles. Each principle had a page. My favorite principle was that your front door must face the sidewalk. And we had 3 pictures, one with an X through it, of downtown front doors that did or did not face the sidewalk. You passed those 21 principles, and you got your building permit in 3 weeks administratively. We made the right thing easy.
Yeah.
And so get rid of the pipeline altogether. The best defense is not to be there.
Yeah, no, I like that tip, make the zoning work better for us. The other point you had was about requiring social housing content in projects, and Gordon Price here is one of the architects of some of the city's policies on that. When he was at council, 20% was the rule, minimum 20% of the big
and
projects.
20% gets us partway there. We need to get to 45. And we're going to have 5 or 6 or 7 solutions to it. I mean, that will be one, and it's going to take time. But if you, as the citizens, really care about affordable housing, you'll really invest in it and solve it yourself, and not expect the newcomer to invest in it and solve it for you. And there's 5 or 6 things you got to do. But long term, as I say, those 2 issues that I talked about are what's going to get us out of this hole, because the pent-up demand is this big, and it's going to take a generation to get there.
The other suggestion I was wondering if you would agree with would be smaller units.
The market's dictating smaller units, because if you're buying a unit downtown here at $1,000 a square foot, in Denver, for instance, that you'll pay $1 million in Cherry or south in Highlands Ranch, 20 miles on a golf course. You'll buy a 6,000 square foot home. Same price buys you a 1,500 square foot condo downtown. The market figures that out. Yes. One more question.
My name is Jay Grosspier, and I'm an individual, not an architect. One mode of transportation I haven't heard about yet is
biking.
Biking. I'd like you to speak on that, and specifically why I want to know is I'm thinking of a personal situation of we're looking at a place like Castlegar. It's in Interior, close to Interior, BC. Having land not in a big city, but in the outskirts, having land to grow food on, being sort of self-sufficient, sustainable home, all of that. And I'm wondering, would that mode of transportation work in that kind of scenario on the outskirts of a town or a small city? Can you speak on that? And would that scenario be sustainable, like within an ideal, potentially an ideal, as far as you're concerned? Mm-hmm. I don't know if I formulated this question clearly or not.
I think I know what you, and do you have a crack at it? Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a run at it. And from a local perspective, and obviously, the reality with British Columbia is the fact that we have a lot of topography, and most of our bottomland, of course, is agricultural. That which makes it conducive to biking is the lands where we haven't intensified. So, the future development, most of our development is going to occur on hillside, which again makes it fairly challenging for, especially as we get less able to move up and down those big hills. So I think we're on a bit of a dichotomy between trying to promote that and at the same time trying to stay away from those areas where maybe biking would be easier on the flatland when we're getting on slopes that are 15 to 30% in north shores of areas of the Lower Mainland or areas that are not bottomland.
Can you speak about Castlegar or somewhere away from Vancouver?
Well, I mean, classically, I think in most of the cities, whether you take Kelowna, where there is existing development on bottomlands, I think it's absolutely realistic that we could get into and utilize that in a better way. I think we're seeing here things like the Pender project, where we've dedicated some of the pavement lane for dedicated bike lanes. I think it's the first part where there's provision of, for instance, communal bikes, the program of sharing a bike, those sorts of things. I think if we provide the opportunity to get onto the vehicle, if we provide the network to get around on it, I think we'll allow people to pick that up. But again, in many Canadian cities, whether it be West Coast rain, whether it be Central Canadian challenges with heat and cool, again, I think there's a limited, uptake or constituency that probably we find in our communities that would take that up. But I think we have a long ways to go, and I think there is encouragement that we can go from 10 to probably 25% without sort of stressing it.
I'll give you two answers as far as places. That in the downtown and in existing walkable urban places that have great bones, 19th century towns like right here, these are challenges for bicycles. And because you want, as a bicyclist, to have your own bike lane to be safe, and it should be that way. And we only have so much, we have a limited right-of-way. Here is about 60 feet, maybe even 55 feet from face to face of the buildings. And so we want to have generous sidewalks. We have transit that we have to deal with, and obviously cars. And we want to park on the street to protect the folks that are walking on the street from all the car traffic. So there's limited amount of space, which generally ends up to being basically an anarchic situation. Everybody just sort of fends for themselves. But the real opportunity, and you're younger, so this is your challenge. As I said, we dealt with the downtowns. Your job is the suburbs. Those huge arterials are the biggest challenge in the suburbs. Right now, those huge arterials that are 120 feet wide are dividers. This little street here, this unifies the two sides of the street. In the suburbs, those 120-foot wide arterials divide the two sides. They need to be narrowed. They could be narrowed by, obviously, streetcars, other forms of transit. They could be narrowed by putting parking onto the streets. They can be narrowed by putting bike lanes. And so take a Parisian Boulevard approach where you can basically have through traffic down the middle, light rail, parking, bike lanes, people walking on the two sides. And in the suburbs, I think that you're going to find that those arterials are going to be very beneficial for the different modes of transportation that we need to help make those places really civilized. On the agricultural issue, obviously we've got to squeeze miles out of the food that we consume. And my partner, Robert Davis, who is the developer of Seaside down in Florida, knows he's spent the last 10 years focusing on the rural-urban connection as far as agriculture. So he's given this a lot more thought. But there's a lot of financial upside. The ultimate goal here is to make that farmland growing arugula into, rather than $5,000 and $7,000 per acre land, which is what farmland's worth today. Maybe it's worth $8,000 because of the run-up in food prices that we've seen recently. But we need to make that land not worth 5, 7, 8, 10,000. We need to make it worth 20, 30, 40,000 because of the because of the intensity of agriculture on it, and because it's so cheap to move the food to the market. And that will keep that farmland from being developed and will be a much less CO2 emitting use as well. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity.
So you see someone as having their own land to grow fruit on for themselves and possibly others as sustainable and a good thing? And
I think it's going to be critical. And you just had Jim Kunstler here a few months ago, didn't you? And if you read his most recent 2 books, one was a nonfiction, one was fiction that just came out about a month ago, talking about the medieval society that will come in the post-peak oil world. Jim takes it a little far, but it sure is humorous and scaring. You know, it scares the bejesus out of you. But you might want to read Jim's new novel that turns back the clock to a different time.
what's the title again?
World shaped by hand, world made by hand. World made by hand. Country.